At the turn of the 20th century, the United States stood in a moment of uneasy confidence, convinced that progress was not only inevitable but manageable, measurable, and moral. Cities swelled with new arrivals, factories roared through the night, and railroads stitched distant regions into a single economic body. Yet beneath this surface of momentum ran a deep current of anxiety. Industrialization had reordered daily life faster than custom, faith, or law could comfortably absorb. Old social restraints weakened as millions left farms for crowded urban neighborhoods, where anonymity replaced familiarity and temptation seemed to multiply under electric light. In this unsettled environment, alcohol became more than a beverage. It became a symbol onto which Americans projected their fears about disorder, decay, and loss of control. For decades, drinking had been woven into American life, present at political gatherings, family celebrations, and the edges of exhausting labor. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, alcohol increasingly appeared in reform literature as the root of social collapse. Saloons clustered near factories and docks, drawing men away from wages and toward habits that reformers described as destructive and humiliating. To many observers, these spaces seemed to swallow paychecks that should have fed children, transforming homes into sites of instability and violence. Whether these portrayals reflected universal truth or selective outrage mattered less than their emotional force. Alcohol became a convenient explanation for complex problems that had no simple solution. Religious institutions played a central role in shaping this interpretation. Protestant churches, especially in rural and small-town America, framed temperance as a moral obligation rather than a personal choice. Sermons linked sobriety to self-mastery, productivity, and spiritual discipline, presenting abstinence as evidence of inner virtue. In an era that prized moral clarity, this framing resonated powerfully. The idea that society could be improved by eliminating a single corrosive influence offered comfort amid uncertainty. It suggested that chaos had a cause, and that cause could be removed through collective will. Women's reform movements further intensified this moral narrative, often drawing from lived experience rather than abstract theology. Many women bore the direct consequences of excessive drinking through financial insecurity and domestic instability, with little legal recourse or social protection. Temperance activism offered both a public voice and a moral platform, allowing women to argue that sobriety was not merely a personal preference but a social necessity. Their campaigns blended compassion with condemnation, portraying alcohol as a force that victimized families and undermined the moral fabric of the nation. At the same time, scientific language entered the debate, lending the temperance an aura of modern legitimacy. Alcohol was increasingly described as a poison rather than a pleasure, a substance that weakened the body and clouded the mind. Medical authorities published studies linking drinking to illness, insanity, and hereditary degeneration. These claims, often overstated or poorly understood, nevertheless aligned neatly with broader anxieties about national fitness. In a period obsessed with efficiency and improvement, the notion that alcohol degraded the population carried alarming implications. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States stood in a moment of uneasy confidence, convinced that progress was not only inevitable but manageable, measurable, and moral. Cities swelled with new arrivals, factories roared through the night, and railroads stitched distant regions into a single economic body. Yet beneath this surface of momentum ran a deep current of anxiety. Industrialization had reordered daily life faster than custom, faith, or law could comfortably absorb. Old social restraints weakened as millions left farms for crowded urban neighborhoods, where anonymity replaced familiarity and temptation seemed to multiply under electric light. In this unsettled environment, alcohol became more than a beverage. It became a symbol onto which Americans projected their fears about disorder, decay, and loss of control. For decades, drinking had been woven into American life, present at political gatherings, family celebrations, and the edges of exhausting labor. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, alcohol increasingly appeared in reform literature as the root of social collapse. Saloons clustered near factories and docks, drawing men away from wages and toward habits that reformers described as destructive and humiliating. To many observers, these spaces seemed to swallow paychecks that should have fed children, transforming homes into sites of instability and violence. Whether these portrayals reflected universal truth or selective outrage mattered less than their emotional force. Alcohol became a convenient explanation for complex problems that had no simple solution. Religious institutions played a central role in shaping this interpretation. Protestant churches, especially in rural and small-town America, framed temperance as a moral obligation rather than a personal choice. Sermons linked sobriety to self-mastery, productivity, and spiritual discipline, presenting abstinence as evidence of inner virtue. In an era that prized moral clarity, this framing resonated powerfully. The idea that society could be improved by eliminating a single corrosive influence offered comfort amid uncertainty. It suggested that chaos had a cause, and that cause could be removed through collective will. Women's reform movements further intensified this moral narrative, often drawing from lived experience rather than abstract theology. Many women bore the direct consequences of excessive drinking through financial insecurity and domestic instability, with little legal recourse or social protection. Temperance activism offered both a public voice and a moral platform, allowing women to argue that sobriety was not merely a personal preference but a social necessity. Their campaigns blended compassion with condemnation, portraying alcohol as a force that victimized families and undermined the moral fabric of the nation. At the same time, scientific language entered the debate, lending the temperance an aura of modern legitimacy. Alcohol was increasingly described as a poison rather than a pleasure, a substance that weakened the body and clouded the mind. Medical authorities published studies linking drinking to illness, insanity, and hereditary degeneration. These claims, often overstated or poorly understood, nevertheless aligned neatly with broader anxieties about national fitness. In a period obsessed with efficiency and improvement, the notion that alcohol degraded the population carried alarming implications. The transformation of temperance from moral persuasion into binding law did not happen suddenly, nor did it emerge from a single ideological center. It unfolded through decades of patient organization, strategic alliances, and an expanding belief that democracy itself could be used to enforce virtue. By the early 20th century, temperance was no longer merely a sermon topic or a household concern. It had matured into a political force, disciplined, coordinated, and increasingly effective at converting moral certainty into legislative reality. At the local level, prohibition had already become familiar. Towns, counties, and entire states experimented with alcohol bans long before national prohibition entered serious discussion. These local victories mattered less for their immediate impact than for the precedent they established. Each dry county was treated as evidence that abstinence could be enforced, that communities could function without alcohol, and that opposition would eventually subside. Failures were rarely framed as proof of impossibility. Instead, they were interpreted as signs that enforcement needed to be stricter, penalties harsher, or public education more thorough. Religious organizations provided the moral infrastructure for this expansion. Churches did not simply preach against alcohol. They mobilized voters, coordinated messaging, and cultivated a shared sense of urgency. Sermons blurred seamlessly into civic instruction, urging congregants to see temperance as a patriotic duty. Abstinence was framed not only as obedience to God, but as loyalty to the nation's future. This moral framing proved powerful because it demanded action. To tolerate alcohol was increasingly portrayed as passive complicity in social decay. The most influential temperance organizations understood the importance of discipline and focus. Rather than dispersing their energy across a range of moral reforms, they concentrated relentlessly on alcohol. Their campaigns were methodical, data-driven by the standards of the time, and emotionally calibrated. Pamphlets, lectures, and traveling speakers presented alcohol as the common denominator behind poverty, crime, illness, and broken families. By simplifying complex social problems into a single cause, the movement made political action feel both urgent and achievable. Crucially, temperance advocates learned how to operate within the machinery of American politics. They cultivated relationships with lawmakers, tracked voting records, and rewarded loyalty with organized electoral support. Politicians who aligned with temperance could expect coordinated backing. Those who resisted faced sustained opposition. Over time, this created a quiet but effective pressure system. Supporting prohibition became less a matter of personal conviction and more a calculation of political survival. Political parties, initially cautious, began to absorb temperance language into their platforms. The issue cut across traditional divides, attracting both progressive reformers and conservative moralists. For progressives, prohibition promised social improvement through rational regulation. For conservatives, it offered a defense of traditional values against perceived moral erosion. This unusual convergence allowed temperance to bypass ideological gridlock. Alcohol was reframed not as a partisan issue, but as a national concern that transcended ordinary politics. The First World War accelerated this convergence. Wartime rhetoric emphasized sacrifice, discipline, and national unity, creating an environment hostile to indulgence. Grain used for alcohol production was portrayed as wasteful when soldiers and allies needed food. Breweries, many with German associations, became targets of suspicion and resentment. Temperance advocates skillfully aligned their cause with wartime patriotism, arguing that sobriety was a contribution to the war effort. In this climate, opposition to prohibition could be cast as selfish or even un-American. By the time the 18th Amendment reached serious consideration, the groundwork had been thoroughly laid. The amendment did not emerge as a radical proposal imposed from above, but as the culmination of a long democratic process. State legislatures ratified it with remarkable speed, reflecting both public pressure and political momentum. To supporters, this rapid approval confirmed what they already believed, that the nation was ready, morally and institutionally, to take this step. Yet the amendment's language revealed the tension at its core. Rather than banning drinking outright, it prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. This distinction reflected both legal caution and lingering unease. Lawmakers sought to regulate behavior without directly criminalizing desire, trusting that limiting access would naturally reduce consumption. It was a compromise that preserved the appearance of moderation while committing the nation to a sweeping moral experiment. The passage of the Volstead Act, which defined and enforced the amendment, further demonstrated how deeply moral vision had entered legislative form. Its strict definitions left little room for ambiguity, classifying even mild beverages as illegal. Supporters argued that clarity was essential for enforcement. Critics warned that such rigidity ignored social reality. But in the prevailing atmosphere of confidence, caution carried little weight. The belief that law could discipline behavior remained dominant. What made this moment distinctive was not simply the content of the legislation, but the faith placed in democratic authority. Prohibition was presented as the will of the people, expressed through constitutional process. This framing insulated it from criticism, at least initially. To oppose prohibition was not merely to disagree with a policy, but to question the moral judgment of the nation itself. As the amendment moved toward implementation, celebrations erupted among its supporters. Bells rang, sermons praised, and newspapers declared the dawn of a cleaner, more orderly era. The law promised to align American life with American ideals, to close the gap between moral aspiration and daily practice. Few paused to consider how enforcement would function across diverse communities, or how deeply alcohol was embedded in social custom. Temperance had become policy, not through force or revolution, but through ballots, legislatures, and constitutional procedure. It stood as a testament to the power of organized conviction within a democratic system. The nation had chosen, deliberately and confidently, to legislate virtue. What remained uncertain was not the law's legitimacy, but its durability in the face of human habit and complexity. When prohibition moved from constitutional text to lived reality, the confidence that had carried it into law encountered a far more complicated terrain. The amendment promised a sober nation, but it did not create, in any meaningful sense, the machinery required to enforce such an ambition. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a quieter unraveling, driven by structural weakness, administrative confusion, and the sheer scale of what the federal government had committed itself to regulate. Before Prohibition, the federal government had played only a limited role in everyday law enforcement. Policing was primarily local, shaped by community norms and constrained resources. Prohibition abruptly reversed that balance, transforming alcohol control into a national responsibility. Overnight, the government was tasked with monitoring thousands of miles of coastline, porous land borders, sprawling cities, rural backroads, and millions of private homes. The law demanded omnipresence, but the state possessed neither the personnel nor the experience to provide it. The agencies assigned to enforce prohibition were assembled hastily, often by repurposing existing bureaucracies rather than building new ones with clear authority. Responsibility shifted between departments, blurring lines of command and accountability. Enforcement officers found themselves uncertain not only of their jurisdiction, but of their mandate. Were they moral guardians, revenue protectors, or criminal investigators? The law offered little guidance, and political leaders rarely clarified the ambiguity. Funding reflected this uncertainty. Prohibition enforcement was never resourced at a level commensurate with its scope. Agents were poorly paid, inadequately trained, and stretched thin across vast territories. In some regions, a handful of officers were expected to monitor entire counties. This scarcity shaped enforcement practices from the start. Rather than systematic control, authorities relied on sporadic raids and symbolic arrests, hoping that visible action would deter widespread defiance. The contradiction at the heart of prohibition enforcement soon became apparent. The law criminalized activities that millions of Americans did not perceive as immoral. Drinking had been reframed as illegal, but it had not been socially erased. This gap placed enforcement officers in an impossible position. They were expected to impose federal authority on behaviors that remained culturally normalized, often within their own communities. In many cases, agents themselves were drawn from populations that quietly resented the law they were tasked with upholding. Local cooperation, essential to any effective enforcement regime, proved inconsistent at best. Sheriffs, police departments, and judges exercised wide discretion, frequently choosing to deprioritize alcohol offenses in favor of crimes they viewed as more serious. Juries were reluctant to convict neighbors for drinking or selling liquor, undermining prosecutions and discouraging agents. The federal government could pass laws, but it could not easily compel belief. Geography further complicated enforcement. Coastal regions became gateways for smuggling, while long, lightly guarded borders offered countless points of entry. Rivers, lakes, and remote trails enabled alcohol to move with remarkable ease. Each new enforcement measure seemed to generate an equally inventive workaround. The law, rigid on paper, struggled to adapt to the fluid realities of terrain and human ingenuity. Administrative contradictions extended beyond logistics. Prohibition was framed as a moral reform, yet its enforcement relied on techniques associated with criminal policing. Surveillance, informants, and raids entered spaces previously considered private. Homes, social clubs, and religious institutions were not immune from suspicion. This intrusion strained public trust, creating resentment even among those who did not actively oppose the law. The promise of moral uplift began to clash with experiences of intrusion and inconsistency. Corruption emerged not as an anomaly, but as a predictable consequence of weak oversight and high incentives. Illegal alcohol generated enormous profits, and underpaid agents found themselves exposed to temptation. Bribes offered a way to supplement income, reduce risk, or simply look the other way. While not all enforcement officials were corrupt, enough were compromised to erode the credibility of the entire system. Each scandal reinforced public skepticism, transforming enforcement into a subject of ridicule rather than respect. The courts, too, became sites of strain. Dockets overflowed with alcohol-related cases, overwhelming judges and prosecutors. Legal challenges questioned the boundaries of search, seizure, and federal authority, forcing the judiciary to navigate unfamiliar territory. While some rulings strengthened enforcement powers, others exposed constitutional tensions that the amendment had not resolved. The law's moral clarity did not translate into legal simplicity. Perhaps the most damaging contradiction lay in selective enforcement. Prohibition did not fall equally across society. Wealthier individuals could access private supplies or discrete delivery networks, while working-class communities were more visible and vulnerable to raids. This uneven application fostered resentment and reinforced perceptions of injustice. A law intended to promote social order instead highlighted existing inequalities. Despite these challenges, official rhetoric remained optimistic. Government reports emphasized arrests made and liquor destroyed, presenting enforcement as steadily improving. This narrative masked deeper structural flaws. Success was measured in seizures rather than compliance, activity rather than outcome. The machinery of enforcement appeared busy, but its motion did not translate into control. Over time, the gap between expectation and reality widened. Prohibition had assumed that law could reshape behavior through authority alone. Enforcement revealed the limits of that assumption. Without broad cultural consent, legal mechanisms became brittle, prone to evasion and abuse. The state could pursue alcohol relentlessly, but it could not eliminate desire, habit, or tradition. From its earliest days, prohibition enforcement was defined less by failure than by contradiction. It was expansive in ambition but narrow in capacity, moral in intent but coercive in practice. The machinery existed, but it was misaligned with the society it sought to regulate. These weaknesses did not immediately end prohibition, but they quietly undermined its foundation, ensuring that the law would be contested not only in courts and legislatures, but in everyday life across the nation. As legal alcohol receded from store shelves and saloons closed their doors, it did not leave behind an empty space. Instead, it created a vacuum that was quickly filled by something quieter, more adaptive, and ultimately far more resilient than lawmakers had anticipated. The disappearance of lawful supply did not extinguish demand. It reorganized it. In the shadows of Prohibition, an invisible economy took shape, not as a temporary rebellion but as a functional system that mirrored, and in some places surpassed, the reach of the legal market it replaced. Bootlegging emerged first as improvisation. Individuals distilled small batches in basements, barns, and backrooms, relying on inherited knowledge and crude equipment. What began as localized, informal production soon evolved into coordinated enterprise. The profits were too large and the demand too steady for disorganization to persist. Supply chains formed almost instinctively, connecting producers, transporters, distributors, and sellers in networks that spanned neighborhoods, cities, and borders. Alcohol became contraband, but its movement followed familiar economic logic. Geography shaped this underground trade with remarkable precision. Coastal cities drew liquor from ships that never intended to dock officially, transferring cargo under cover of darkness. Rivers and lakes became arteries of transport, while rural landscapes offered concealment for distilleries far from prying eyes. Borders that had once been administrative lines now marked opportunity, as alcohol flowed in from countries where it remained legal. Each route adapted to local conditions, demonstrating a flexibility that federal enforcement struggled to match. Speakeasies became the most visible expression of this hidden economy, though their visibility was carefully curated. Behind unmarked doors and false storefronts, drinking returned as a social ritual rather than a public spectacle. These establishments varied widely, from crude rooms serving watered-down spirits to elegant spaces that rivaled pre-Prohibition lounges. What united them was not secrecy alone, but normalization. Attendance did not require ideological opposition to Prohibition. It required only participation in a shared understanding that the law and daily life were no longer aligned. The clientele reflected this shift. Speakeasies drew professionals, laborers, artists, politicians, and law enforcement officers alike. Drinking ceased to be a marker of defiance and became an unremarkable aspect of social interaction. This quiet consensus sustained the underground economy more effectively than any conspiracy could have. The law remained on the books, but it no longer structured behavior. Instead, people adapted around it, constructing parallel routines that felt natural rather than illicit. Organized crime did not invent this system, but it quickly recognized its potential. Groups capable of coordinating production and distribution at scale moved to consolidate control, offering consistency, protection, and efficiency. Violence, while present, was less central than organization. The true power of these networks lay in their ability to deliver alcohol reliably, settle disputes internally, and absorb risk that smaller operators could not. Criminal enterprise became managerial rather than chaotic, embedding itself deeply within the economic life of cities. Money flowed through this invisible economy with surprising openness. Payments were made in cash, favors, and influence, circulating through restaurants, nightclubs, warehouses, and transportation firms. Legitimate businesses often served as fronts or partners, blurring the line between lawful commerce and illegal trade. The distinction mattered less in practice than in theory. To many participants, bootlegging felt less like crime and more like adaptation, a rational response to a law that ignored lived reality. Corruption followed predictably, not because of universal moral failure, but because the system demanded it. Police officers, customs officials, and politicians encountered opportunities to profit from tolerance rather than enforcement. Some accepted bribes to supplement inadequate wages. Others simply chose not to interfere. Each act of accommodation reinforced the system's stability. Enforcement did not disappear, but it became selective, negotiated, and uneven, further entrenching the underground market. Cultural life adapted alongside economics. Jazz clubs, dance halls, and private parties flourished, fueled by illicit alcohol and a sense of shared transgression that felt less dangerous than invigorating. Media coverage oscillated between condemnation and fascination, transforming bootleggers and speakeasies into symbols of modernity and rebellion. This portrayal softened public attitudes, framing participation as stylish rather than shameful. The underground economy gained not only customers, but cultural legitimacy. What made this system durable was not secrecy, but integration. It did not exist apart from mainstream society. It ran through it. Workers ended their shifts in speakeasies. Politicians attended gatherings supplied by bootleg liquor. Families stored bottles for holidays and celebrations. Alcohol's absence from legality did not remove it from ritual. Instead, it relocated those rituals into spaces that operated quietly, efficiently, and with broad consent. The federal government's response lagged behind this evolution. Enforcement strategies targeted visible nodes rather than structural flows, disrupting individual operations without dismantling networks. Each raid created temporary shortages that drove prices higher, increasing profits and attracting new participants. The underground economy adapted faster than policy could respond, learning from each intervention and refining its methods accordingly. By the mid-1920s, the invisible economy was no longer emerging. It was established. It employed thousands, generated immense revenue, and functioned with a degree of predictability that belied its illegality. Prohibition had not eliminated alcohol. It had privatized its distribution, transferring control from regulated markets to shadow systems governed by demand and opportunity. This parallel economy revealed a fundamental miscalculation at the heart of Prohibition. Law had removed legality, but it had not removed desire. In the space between those two realities, an entire economic world had taken root. It did not announce itself, and it did not seek legitimacy. It simply worked, day after day, bottle by bottle, quietly reshaping American life beneath the surface of the law. As the underground economy matured, it did more than supply alcohol. It reconfigured power. What had begun as a decentralized response to Prohibition slowly consolidated into structures capable of exercising influence over neighborhoods, institutions, and entire cities. Illicit alcohol did not merely coexist with American society. It began to reorganize it, embedding criminal enterprise into the ordinary rhythms of urban life until the distinction between legality and illegality grew increasingly abstract. Organized crime expanded not through spectacle, but through management. The most successful groups understood that stability was more valuable than chaos. They focused on coordination, territory, and logistics, reducing unnecessary conflict that might draw attention. Violence, when it occurred, was purposeful rather than impulsive, used to enforce contracts, secure routes, or eliminate competition. This disciplined approach allowed criminal organizations to operate with a consistency that mirrored legitimate businesses, offering reliability in a market defined by risk. Cities proved especially fertile ground for this transformation. Dense populations ensured steady demand, while complex bureaucracies created layers of opportunity for negotiation and influence. Criminal networks aligned themselves with transportation systems, labor unions, and entertainment venues, weaving their operations into the urban infrastructure. Alcohol profits funded expansion into other illicit activities, but liquor remained the backbone, providing predictable income and social access. Through it, criminal figures became familiar presences rather than distant threats. Corruption spread not as a sudden moral collapse, but as a gradual accommodation. Police officers, prosecutors, and city officials faced a daily contradiction, enforcing a law widely ignored by the public. In this environment, selective enforcement became common. Bribes were framed as practical solutions rather than betrayals, payments that reduced conflict and maintained order. Each compromise decision lowered the barrier for the next, until corruption functioned less as exception and more as expectation. Political institutions were not immune. Campaigns required funding, and illicit alcohol generated it in abundance. In return for financial support, criminal organizations sought protection, favorable appointments, or simple indifference. This exchange rarely needed explicit agreement. Shared interests aligned naturally in a system where enforcement discretion held enormous value. The result was a quiet erosion of accountability, difficult to trace and even harder to reverse. For the public, these shifts altered perception more than behavior. Early support for prohibition had been rooted in moral optimism, but lived experience introduced nuance. As speakeasies multiplied and enforcement faltered, participation lost its sense of defiance. Drinking became routine again, stripped of ideological weight. People attended gatherings, hosted parties, and frequented establishments that operated openly in all but name. The law receded into background noise, acknowledged but rarely obeyed. This normalization extended to attitudes toward crime itself. Bootleggers who delivered reliable service were seen less as criminals and more as providers. Their ability to navigate the law's contradictions earned a kind of pragmatic respect. Media portrayals reinforced this shift, depicting figures of the underground as clever, stylish, and modern. Crime was no longer solely associated with danger or disorder. It was increasingly framed as an enterprise. Moral boundaries blurred accordingly. The distinction between those who enforced the law and those who violated it became uncertain when both frequented the same spaces and benefited from the same arrangements. Public trust in institutions weakened not because of dramatic scandals alone, but because of pervasive inconsistency. Laws that applied selectively lost their authority, encouraging a culture of negotiation rather than compliance. The normalization of criminal enterprise carried subtle consequences. As illegal networks gained legitimacy through familiarity, they also gained influence over labor, housing, and local economies. Decisions that once flowed through civic channels increasingly passed through informal power structures. This shift did not announce itself as a crisis. It felt incremental, a series of small adaptations that collectively altered how cities functioned. Prohibition had sought to elevate public morality through law. Instead, it fostered an environment where moral judgment became situational. Participation in the underground economy did not require ideological opposition or criminal identity. It required only acceptance of contradiction. People learned to live with the dissonance between law and practice, adjusting expectations rather than demanding resolution. By the late 1920s, this accommodation was widespread. Prohibition remained officially intact, but socially diluted. Crime had not overtaken society, but it had been absorbed into it. The presence of organized criminal networks was no longer shocking. It was understood, managed, and often ignored. What had changed was not merely behavior, but perception. illegality had been rendered ordinary. This normalization marked a turning point. The question was no longer whether prohibition aligned with American values, but whether the values themselves had shifted under its pressure. The law had succeeded in revealing how flexible morality could become when enforcement failed and incentives persisted. In doing so, it reshaped the relationship between citizens, institutions, and authority. Crime and corruption did not destroy prohibition overnight. They transformed it quietly, hollowing out its moral foundation while leaving its legal shell intact. By the time doubts became explicit, participation was already habitual. The nation had not abandoned its ideals, but it had learned to live without them fully governing daily life. In that adjustment, the legacy of prohibition took on a deeper significance, one measured not only in crime statistics or political debates, but in the altered expectations of what law could reasonably demand from society. As prohibition settled into permanence, American culture did not resist it loudly so much as it quietly reshaped itself around its constraints. Drinking, stripped of legality, shed many of its older meanings and acquired new ones. What had once been a public, routine practice became selective, performative, and increasingly symbolic. The transformation was subtle, unfolding through habit rather than protest, until the cultural landscape bore little resemblance to the moral vision that had animated the ban in the first place. Social behavior adapted first. The saloon, once a male-dominated space rooted in class and labor, gave way to more fluid environments. Drinking migrated into private apartments, hotel suites, basements, and clubs that blurred the line between social gathering and entertainment venues. These spaces encouraged a different rhythm of interaction, one less bound by tradition and more attuned to novelty. Alcohol became part of curated experiences rather than habitual routine, consumed in settings that emphasized atmosphere, exclusivity, and style. This shift altered gender norms in ways prohibition's architects had not anticipated. Women, who had been central to the temperance movement, now found themselves participating in the very culture the movement sought to eliminate. Speakeasies and private parties created mixed-gender spaces where women drank publicly alongside men, often for the first time. This visibility challenged older assumptions about propriety and restraint. Drinking became a marker of modernity, signaling independence rather than moral failure. Fashion and behavior reflected this change. Women adopted styles that emphasized mobility and confidence, attending nightlife events that would have been socially discouraged a generation earlier. Men, too, adjusted their expectations, navigating social settings that no longer revolved around exclusively male camaraderie. Prohibition inadvertently accelerated cultural shifts already underway, loosening rigid social codes under the guise of moral regulation. Nightlife flourished not despite prohibition, but because of it. Illicit venues competed on experience rather than accessibility, cultivating music, decor, and performance to attract patrons. Jazz, already emerging as a cultural force, found fertile ground in these spaces. Its improvisational energy mirrored the era's social experimentation, reinforcing a sense of living at the edge of convention. Nightclubs became sites of cultural exchange, where racial, class, and generational boundaries softened, if only temporarily. Media portrayals both reflected and shaped this evolving attitude. Newspapers initially framed prohibition violations as cautionary tales, emphasizing raids and arrests. Over time, coverage grew more ambivalent, oscillating between criticism and fascination. Films, novels, and popular songs portrayed speakeasies as glamorous, bootleggers as clever, and enforcement as cumbersome. These depictions did not necessarily celebrate lawbreaking, but they normalized it, presenting participation as understandable rather than deviant. Humor played a crucial role in this normalization. Jokes about hidden flasks, secret passwords, and evasive tactics circulated widely, reducing the moral gravity of prohibition. Laughter transformed defiance into social bonding, reinforcing the sense that the law was out of step with everyday life. The seriousness that had once surrounded temperance rhetoric dissipated, replaced by irony and indulgent critique. Family life adjusted as well. Alcohol re-entered domestic spaces under new rules, stored discreetly and consumed selectively. Celebrations continued, holidays were observed, and rituals adapted. Children grew up aware of the law's existence but also of its porousness, absorbing lessons about negotiation and discretion. The moral clarity promised by prohibition gave way to a more ambiguous understanding of authority, one that acknowledged rules while expecting exceptions. Religious institutions, once unified in support, experienced quiet division. Some continued to champion abstinence as a spiritual ideal, while others softened their tone, recognizing the gap between doctrine and practice. Sermons shifted focus, emphasizing personal responsibility over legal compliance. This adjustment signaled a broader retreat from the idea that morality could be imposed externally. Faith adapted, as culture had, to a reality shaped by contradiction. The cumulative effect of these changes was not rebellion, but drift. The ideals that had justified prohibition did not vanish, they faded. Sobriety remained virtuous in theory, but it no longer defined respectability. Participation in illicit drinking did not carry the stigma reformers had anticipated. Instead, it became one of many negotiated behaviors in a society accustomed to balancing principle with convenience. This drift reshaped public discourse. Debates about prohibition grew less moralistic and more pragmatic. Discussions centered on enforcement costs, crime, and economic impact rather than virtue and vice. The language of reform lost its urgency, replaced by a tone of fatigue. The question was no longer how to perfect society, but how to manage the consequences of an imperfect law. Prohibition's cultural legacy lay in this quiet transformation. By attempting to enforce a singular moral vision, it exposed the flexibility of social norms and the limits of legal authority over private behavior. Americans did not abandon morality, they reinterpreted it, prioritizing context and choice over universal mandate. Drinking culture survived by adapting, embedding itself within new forms that reflected changing values. By the late 1920s, the nation's relationship with alcohol bore little resemblance to the one prohibition had sought to erase. The law remained, but its moral resonance had diminished. Culture had moved on, not in defiance, but in accommodation. In that movement, prohibition revealed an enduring truth about American society: that ideals imposed without consensus tend to dissolve into practice, reshaped by the very lives they aim to regulate. When the Great Depression settled over the United States, it stripped away illusions with a force no moral argument ever could. Factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment climbed to levels that reshaped daily existence. In this climate of scarcity, prohibition's contradictions were no longer abstract. They became measurable, visible, and increasingly intolerable. What had once been defended as a moral investment now appeared as an economic liability the nation could no longer afford. The loss of tax revenue was impossible to ignore. Before Prohibition, alcohol taxes had formed a substantial portion of federal income, funding public services and stabilizing budgets. With legal alcohol eliminated, that revenue vanished at precisely the moment when government demand expanded. Relief programs, infrastructure projects, and emergency aid required funding on a scale previously unimaginable. Policymakers faced a stark reality. They were attempting to manage an economic catastrophe while voluntarily excluding one of the most reliable sources of public income. At the same time, enforcement costs mounted relentlessly. Prohibition required agents, courts, prisons, and administrative oversight, all of which demanded sustained funding. Arrests and seizures increased expenditures without generating corresponding returns. From a fiscal perspective, the system consumed resources while empowering illegal markets that paid no taxes at all. This imbalance became increasingly difficult to justify to a population grappling with unemployment and hunger. Public fatigue deepened the problem. Years of selective enforcement, cultural adaptation, and normalized evasion had eroded the law's moral authority. The Depression intensified this weariness, shifting priorities away from social engineering toward survival. When families struggled to secure food and shelter, debates over moral purity felt remote. The question facing many Americans was no longer whether prohibition was virtuous, but whether it was useful. Economic arguments began to dominate public discourse. Repeal advocates emphasized job creation, highlighting how legal alcohol production could revive agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation. Breweries, distilleries, and taverns promised employment for thousands, offering immediate relief in depressed communities. These claims resonated with urgency. Prohibition supporters, once confident, struggled to counter proposals that addressed tangible suffering with practical solutions. Political leaders adjusted accordingly. Positions that had once been considered risky or immoral became increasingly defensible. Candidates began to speak openly about repeal, framing it not as a surrender of values, but as a necessary adaptation to extraordinary circumstances. The language of debate shifted from moral absolutism to pragmatic governance. This rhetorical change signaled a broader transformation in how Americans understood the relationship between law and reality. The Democratic Party, sensing opportunity, embraced repeal more decisively. It aligned the issue with economic recovery, arguing that restoring legal alcohol would strengthen public finances and weaken organized crime. This framing allowed repeal to be presented as reform rather than retreat. It suggested that the original experiment, while well-intentioned, had produced consequences incompatible with national stability. Public opinion followed. Polls, editorials, and referenda revealed growing support for repeal across regions and social classes. The coalition that had once sustained prohibition fragmented under economic pressure. Religious organizations softened their stance, prioritizing charitable work over legislative crusade. Reform groups redirected energy toward unemployment relief and social welfare. The moral urgency that had powered the movement dissipated, replaced by a sober reassessment of costs and outcomes. Importantly, repeal was not driven by nostalgia for pre-prohibition excess. It was shaped by disillusionment. Americans had witnessed the law's effects over more than a decade, observing how it had altered institutions, empowered crime, and distorted enforcement. The Depression clarified these observations, transforming critique into consensus. Repeal emerged not as a rejection of reform, but as recognition of miscalculation. The constitutional process reflected this shift. The 21st Amendment moved through ratification with remarkable speed, mirroring the momentum that had once carried the 18th. Yet the tone was different. There were fewer celebrations, fewer declarations of moral triumph. Instead, repeal was framed as correction, an adjustment grounded in experience rather than aspiration. The nation had tested an idea and found its limits. Economic logic, dominated the final arguments. Legal alcohol promised taxable commerce, regulated production, and reduced enforcement burden. It offered a way to reclaim control over a market that had flourished beyond the law's reach. For policymakers confronting Depression-era realities, this logic was compelling. Ideals mattered, but solvency mattered more. When repeal arrived, it did so quietly. The return of legal alcohol was regulated, cautious, and uneven across states. Local control remained, reflecting lessons learned about cultural difference and enforcement capacity. The federal government retreated from moral regulation, acknowledging the constraints of authority. This recalibration marked a subtle but significant change in governance philosophy. Prohibition ended not with collapse, but with consent. The decision to repeal reflected a collective judgment shaped by hardship, observation, and fatigue. Americans did not declare the experiment a failure in moral terms. They accepted it as incomplete, unsustainable under pressure, and misaligned with economic reality. The Great Depression did more than strain the nation's finances. It clarified priorities. In that clarification, Prohibition's costs outweighed its promises. Fiscal necessity, public exhaustion, and evolving values converged to undo what confidence and conviction had once built. The law that sought to engineer virtue gave way to a humbler approach, one that acknowledged the limits of legislation in shaping human behavior. Repeal did not restore the country to its previous state. Too much had changed for that. But it closed a chapter defined by ambition and contradiction, replacing it with a cautious pragmatism forged in crisis. In choosing reversal, the nation demonstrated not weakness, but adaptation, responding to reality with the same democratic mechanisms that had once enforced a moral vision. When Prohibition formally ended, the United States did not experience a moment of restoration so much as one of reckoning. Legal alcohol returned, but the nation it re-entered was no longer the one that had outlawed it. 13 years of enforced abstinence, uneven compliance, and institutional strain had altered the republic in ways that could not be repealed by amendment. What remained was not simply the memory of a failed experiment, but a set of lasting transformations that reshaped governance, law, and public trust. One of the most enduring changes was the expansion of federal authority. Prohibition had dramatically increased the federal government's presence in everyday life, normalizing national involvement in activities once regulated locally or informally. Even after repeal, that expansion did not fully recede. The infrastructure built to enforce prohibition, agencies, surveillance practices, and legal precedents, set patterns that would be reused in later regulatory efforts. The idea that the federal state could police morality at scale had been tested and found flawed, but the capacity to intervene remained. Criminal justice bore similar marks. Prohibition had blurred the line between crime and custom, forcing courts and law enforcement to confront the consequences of criminalizing widely accepted behavior. This experience influenced later debates about punishment, discretion, and proportionality. The system emerged more cautious, aware of how easily overreach could undermine legitimacy. Yet it also carried forward techniques refined during Prohibition, including coordinated federal policing and interagency cooperation. The legacy was ambivalent, greater capacity paired with deeper skepticism. Public trust suffered a quieter erosion. Years of selective enforcement and normalized evasion had taught citizens that laws could exist without commanding obedience. This lesson lingered. Americans became more attuned to the gap between statute and practice, more willing to negotiate authority rather than accept it unconditionally. While this skepticism did not destroy faith in democracy, it tempered it, fostering a more pragmatic, sometimes cynical, view of governance. Attitudes toward morality legislation shifted most profoundly. Prohibition revealed the limits of using law to enforce virtue without broad, sustained consensus. Reform movements did not disappear, but they recalibrated. Future efforts focused more on regulation than prohibition, harm reduction rather than moral elimination. The experience encouraged humility, suggesting that social behavior could be guided but not wholly engineered by legal decree. Culturally, the episode left a residue of irony. Prohibition entered history not as a triumph or a tragedy, but as a cautionary chapter. It became shorthand for overconfidence, invoked whenever moral certainty threatened to outpace social reality. This narrative shaped American identity, reinforcing a self-image grounded in experimentation and correction rather than ideological permanence. The nation survived Prohibition intact, but altered. It emerged more powerful institutionally, more cautious morally, and more skeptical socially. The Republic endured, but it did so having learned that survival often requires adjustment rather than insistence. Prohibition's true legacy lay not in its repeal, but in the enduring awareness it produced, that law, however well-intentioned, must ultimately contend with the complexity of human behavior. In that recognition, the United States was never quite the same again.